Hello and welcome to Insight. I'm Kusum Wijetilleke. My guest today is Rehan Jayawickreme, the former chairman of the Weligama Urban Council and the current vice chairman of the SJB Youth. Hi Rehan, thank you very much for being here.
Hi.
Appreciate it.
Hi, Kusum.
So full disclosure to our audience, Rehan and I have been long-term close friends, perhaps since our teenage years, but let's not dwell too much on that because it might give away our age. So Rehan, you've you're in politics, but I think, as I said, we've been friends for a long time. Most of my friends and I, when we had a superficial view of politics growing up, you were someone who always had a little more information, you had a few anecdotal stories, and you understood a little more the history of certain issues when they pop up in our political scenario, as they usually do. So I'd like to just discuss your political background and also the familiar links you have through, say, the United National Party to in Kegol, for instance, in Weligama, where you had your electorate. So if you could just tell us about your political roots.
So I think to start off with, both my granduncles, so my mother's uncle was the General Secretary of the United National Party. He was also the Defense Minister. So that's my grandfather's brother. That's the late General Rehan Jayawickreme. And then from my father's side in Weligama, where my father and most of his family were born, my father's uncle was Major Untitled Chapter. So I think when it comes to political experience, I think Monty was far ahead than Ranjan. He was in politics. He ironically started from the Weligama Urban Council, and he was the mayor of Weligama. He was one of the first mayors there. And I think from the first cabinet all the way up until the last cabinet, he held some sort of portfolio up until 1989, where he was then appointed as governor by the late President Premadasa. So taking that also aside, our family is very politically oriented. They're very politically opinionated. That's because my mother was also working very closely with Mr. Rehan Jayawickreme. She was politically very close to him. But then the funny story is that my father, he was not granted nomination by the UMP in 1989. And he actually ended up contesting from the Sri Lankan Freedom Party. And my mother, from then on until I started my politics, she was more oriented towards the policies of the Sri Lankan Freedom Party, and then later on towards the politics of her counterparts that she knew very well. But and also my mother and father, they divorced at a very young age. When me and my brother, I have one brother who's now in Australia. He's a police officer. So when we were very young, my mother and father divorced, and my mother remarried another politician who was Mr. Mano Wijeratne. So he was Nisanka Wijeratne's son, Edwin Wijeratne's grandson. He was a long-standing member of the United National Party, and also he first went to Parliament in 1989.
He had a major influence on you, didn't he?
Yes, he did, because I basically was lucky enough to have two fathers. One was my biological father, who was living in Weligama, and one was my stepfather, who was with my mother, and I grew up with my mom. So I was basically his son. He also had two children, but then me and my brother were also like his children. And he first won in 1989. He continued all the way up until 2000, where he briefly lost. Then again, if you remember correctly, there was another election that took place within a year or two, I think. Yeah. He came on the Kegol list. I think he was third during that election when Rukman Senanayake became first, who is also incidentally closely related to me. We are very closely related to the Senanayakes as well. Right. So he played a big influence in my life. But then later on, he, together with 17 MPs, they crossed over from the dictatorial Ranil Wickremesinghe regime and then went leaned towards Mahinda Rajapaksa, solely because of the fact that the UMP at that time were prepared to defeat the budget, and if the budget was defeated, the war wouldn't have continued. And irrelevant of what we think about the war, he then supported the war victory, and he passed away in 2010. A year later, my father passed away, and I started politics in 2015. I officially joined the United National Party. Even though I was very reluctant to do so under the leadership of Mr. Wickremesinghe, I still did it. That too because of Mr. Premadasa, who was the deputy leader at the time, because of his influence, and Mr. Karu Jayasuriya. and I contested my first election to the urban council. And I basically started my politics, even though I was from a political background. I didn't see that as a qualification, neither did I see it as a disqualification. But what I thought was that the best thing to do would be to start politics at a lower level. And then I ended up becoming mayor of Weligama, or chairman of the Weligama Urban Council. And the rest is now, I think, history. And
it certainly is. I mean, just before we come to your political career, I think you've also had a colorful past, and you've had some run-ins with the law which are well publicized. You've also had an infamous relationship with the son of another MP. There's also questions about the friendships you have. I mean, you went to St. Thomas's amongst, as well as British school in Stafford.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we know when you grow up in Colombo, especially when you go to a school such as St. Thomas's, you get a lot of connections, you meet a lot of people. So some of your relationships, friendships with political personalities have been questioned, especially with people on social media. They ask these questions. So would you give our audience an understanding of all these relationships, and just sort of, because the allegation is that, okay, this is another scion of a political family of sorts who is also, I guess, an entrenched member of political elite, etc. So could you just sort of push back against that critique?
No, so I'll start off with about the friendship that I shared with, so I'm going to be very open. I was good friends with Minister Mervyn Silva's son, former Minister Mervyn Silva's son, Malaka. I got to know him when I was about 16 or 17. Of course, our friendship has been much longer than that. We've known each other since we were children. But I did associate him very closely. I'm not going to lie to you. But there was a point in my life where I realized that I needed to make a few changes, that I can't always continue partying, that I needed to get my foot into some sort of career. And then, because I always want to get married and have children, I thought that this is going to be my next step. But saying that, in 2012, we had a run-in with an army major. That was the famous army major incident that happened outside the Jai Kilton. And we were watching election results at that time. And yes, I do admit that I was there. However, I was not part of anything that happened afterwards. And we ultimately got remanded. So there is no one that can say that political interference was used. I remember my mother was Sri Lanka's ambassador for Turkey at the time. And one thing that she spoke to me and she said was, if you have not done anything wrong, produce yourself in court, but don't expect any favors from me. So then I actually got produced in court. We were remanded for a period of 14 days. On the 9th day, we were granted bail because the army major issued an affidavit. And I was exonerated and I was cleared of all charges. And I still remember my older brother in Australia. He wrote a letter while I was in Velikada. He wrote a letter and it was published by Mr. C.H. Jayawickreme on the island. And if anyone wants to Google, they can just go and type my brother's name and they'll find it on Google. And I was very annoyed by that letter because he was rather critical of me. But there was a very striking paragraph at the end. If I remember correctly, it was at the end. He said, letting bygones be bygones, it is now up to you to decide if this is the path you're going to go, or whether you're going to forge a new identity, that which is independent from your ancestors or your political relationships with your political relations or our relations. And you need to now forge a different path, and it's up to you to decide if you're ready or not. So I actually didn't speak to my brother for a few months after that, because I was thinking, why did he have to write to the newspaper? But the more I became mature and the more I decided that my life needs to go in a different path, I realized that it is that letter that actually changed me. And that was the breaking point. And then you asked me about my time at St. Thomas's. So ironically, St. Thomas's was where I met Namal Rajapaksa. I can't remember this clearly because I was in grade 1. But my mother says that while I was being put to school and my mother brought me to school, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Miss Shiranti Rajapaksa brought Namal to school. So Namal and I grew up together. So we were classmates from year 1 till year 10, till I left college. And we were friends. But the Namal Rajapaksa I knew then is not who he is perceived to be now. And we somewhat politically, ideologically, we drifted apart. Because my ideology, and to be very honest with you, because of the fact that I was very disappointed with Mr. Wickremesinghe from 2005 onwards, since he lost to Mahinda Rajapaksa, I was somewhat more inclined politically in supporting Mahinda Rajapaksa. the former president. But then it came to a point post 2010 when I started seeing all these human rights atrocities. When I looked at when I saw Lasantha being killed, when I saw in the papers that Lasantha had been killed, when I saw the Keith Noya abduction, when I started seeing the white vans and how predominantly they were being used in Colombo for anti-terror measures, and when people were not returning back to their families, that kind of drifted me away from the political ideology of the Rajapakshas. So in 2015, I made a decision that I was going to join the United National Party, and I was denied nominations by Mr. Wickremesinghe because he didn't want me contesting Weligama, knowing full well what my connections were in Weligama. So that's the history I have with them. But like I say, Kusum, my life has always been an open book. There is nothing that I have hidden in my life. But I always believe in reinventing myself or changing for the better. And I think from the time that I was arrested in 2012 to now, I think not only my constituents, but I think the general public know what I'm about now. My ethics, my morals, my political morals are very clear, and have always been clear.
Right. When you wrote that infamous letter to Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, you were actually quite respectful as well in your tone, but you were then suspended from the UNP, and I believe you had some disciplinary action taken against you. So would you mind just reminding our audience of your thought process and why you decided to go against the lead of the UNP at the time?
In the letter that I addressed to him, but before I get back on the letter, I'll tell you what really drove me to do that. I was not supported by anyone other than Mangala Samaraweera to become the mayor of Weligama. But it was all based on meritocracy. I had received 87% of the total vote. Even though the Pohottuwa list was rejected at that election, the rest of the UMP guys who contested with me were on averages of 40 to 47%. I had beaten all of them by 30%, and I had got 87%. I had got 1,100 or something out of 1,300 votes, right? And what was told to us before the election was that whoever gets the highest percentage will be in the contention to be the chairman or the mayor. So at that time, Mr. Sagal Ratnayaka, he was the district leader, he was the deputy district leader of Mathura, he opposed it. Lots of others opposed it, and it was only Mangala who spoke on my behalf. And I was right there when he made a few phone calls. He said, look, we need Rehan, we need someone with the English-speaking background that he has to handle a tourism zone like Weligama. And also, he has won the election, so please make him chairman. So Mr. Wickremesinghe was very reluctant to do it. But when Mr. Samaraweera gave me that position, I accepted it with humility and I did the best of my abilities. But then what happened later was that I started seeing this governance system of what he had. I started seeing the deals that they pulled to get people out of trouble. So that's why my main contention now is there is no point blaming the Rajapakshas for what they did post 2015, because 2015 the people of this country gave opportunity to Mr. Wickremesinghe and Maithripala Sirisena to rid the country of them or to really go after them, but they didn't do that. And it's not something that I may be able to prove in court, but I'm saying this in front of a camera now without any parliamentary privileges protecting me. So anyone is free to take me to court. But there were underhand deals that were being cut. So I started seeing all of this. Then I saw the bond scam and how obviously complicit the rulers were with that crime. How Mr. Wickremesinghe, the president, now bought a Singaporean national who was not even a Sri Lankan dual citizen, because Singaporeans can't be dual citizens. So knowing full well that if something goes wrong, that Mr. Arjuna Mahendran can leave the country, Mr. Wickremesinghe bought him down and made him a central bank governor amidst criticisms from everyone, almost everyone in our camp as well. He still went ahead and he did that. So that kind of started making me feel a little bit of animosity. But what really triggered me was the Easter Sunday attack. Because that's one day where I honestly got sick of politics. Because here was intelligence reports coming in from India that there is going to be a terror attack. And we have two rulers who are angry at each other. So one ruler, the Prime Minister, decided, oh look, I'm not going to go for the Security Council, right? But the Security Council, what his response was that he was not invited by President Sirisena. Now, what do you do as the Prime Minister if you are not invited? You raise the issue in Parliament. You raise a matter of privilege in front of the Speaker. And you say, constitutionally, I am obliged to go for this, and he has not been inviting me. Why can't I go?
Yeah.
But then he didn't go for 6 months, and neither did he tell anyone that he's not going for the Security Council. And this created an even bigger rift between the President and the Prime Minister. And this resulted in intelligence reports not being paid enough attention to, and the Easter Sunday attack happened. Then I finally fixated my mind, and at that time, the whole Sajith Premadasa uprising was already happening in our party. There were lots of members, including members like Mangala Samaravira, who were very vocal about it, but didn't put it out to the public. But then, about a month later, after the Easter Sunday attack, I thought enough is enough. And Kusum, I want everyone to read that letter, what I sent Mr. Wickremesinghe.
Yes, yes.
In that letter, I have called him a very smart man. And I have also said that he had 2 golden opportunities to win elections. One was in 2000, but unfortunately, because of the terror attack carried out on CBK, the former president, she received some sort of sympathy vote and he lost.
Yes.
But then the UMP again gave him a chance. And this was in 2005. And in 2005, again, he was well poised to become victorious, but the North and East votes were stopped, ironically by the same people that Mr. Wickremesinghe has joined hands with now. The North and East vote was lost, and he lost the presidency. But in my letter, I say, sir, that is where your time ends. Because I think to win in politics, you got to be 50% or 60% lucky, and 40% you got to, it has to be on your skill level. But in 2005, because of the fact that he assumed the mantle in 1994, it was already 10 plus years since he's become the leader of the UMP.
That's right.
And we've lost multiple elections. There was not a single election that we won after he became leader.
Yeah.
So I thought this was the best time for him to give up. And in my opinion at that time, he should have given it to Karu Jayasuriya. Because by that time, Karu was already a rising star in the UMP.
Yes.
He had become the Colombo mayor, and Mr. Wickremesinghe started a witch hunt against him, and then knew that if he's in Colombo, it will be disastrous for him, so sent him to Gampaha, where he'll have to compete with Andra Bandaranaike. He made life very difficult for him.
That's what led to Ms. Jayasuriya leaving the party.
Yes. And in 2005 was when people started calling for a leadership change. So in my letter, I said, this is the time you should have given it, but now your time is up, because you have people like Sagal Ratnayake around you who doesn't make your life any much easier when it comes to interacting with the common man of the country. And I said, now's the time that you need to leave. And I said, please play a role in this party, but make Sajith Premadasa your candidate. And if you feel that you cannot give it to Sajith Premadasa, I have also mentioned in that letter that you can give it to Karu. So the way he took it was what surprised me.
Right.
I was immediately called by the General Secretary, Akhila Viraj Kariyavasam. I was asked to give an explanation, and I said, I'm not going to give explanations on the phone. If you want to ask me something, you ask me to come to the party office and make me sit in front of you, and I'll give you my answers. So within 4 days, my party membership was suspended. And Kusum, I was in that mayoral election, there were only 2 bodies that the UMP got in the entire southern district. That is Weligama and Tangol. Ravindra Vedarachi from Tangol and myself from Weligama. He decided to suspend me. He got all my council members to work against me. I had extreme difficulty passing budgets, my annual budgets, but I always got them done. And there was not a single allegation of corruption or bribery against me. And if someone can find any allegation of bribery against me while I was the chairman of the Weligama Urban Council, I will give up politics, because I know for a fact there was nothing of that sort. But then the way they reacted, they suspended me, then they expelled me, right? They tried to take away certain development projects that were coming into the Weligama Urban Council. They were pressurizing Mangala Samaravira to try and stop these development projects. And when the general election time came, I had no choice but to contest from the SJB. But how can a leader who is also part of the International Democratic Association or Union in the world, who is an official member, how can he preach democracy to the people of this country if he started as the UMP leader in 1994 and he is still the UMP leader? He has still not given it to a second generation. So how can you trust a man? And his recent policy statement in Parliament, Kusum, you would have realized when he started talking about the youth. How can you talk about the youth of the country when you have completely diminished the youth factions in the United National Party? Yes. Where there is no second tier, there is no third tier. Yes. Everything is based on one man.
All things considered, Rehan, though, when you wrote that letter to Mr. Jayawickreme, you were taking a risk.
Yes.
Right? And when the decision was taken by many prominent members of the UNP to join with Sajid Premadasa and form a new party, the SJB, especially for someone like you who was fairly young in the process, and you were just coming up, you came up in the UNP. So to give up that kind of a risk and to join with Sajid Premadasa, you must have had a fair amount of faith in the organization that Mr. Premadasa and the other prominent politicians from the UNP were building. So could you just give us some idea of what drove you?
If you can find me one politician in the local government level with far-reaching powers of that what you have when you're a mayor or a chairman, if you can find me one politician who threw it all on the line in the belief of one man, again, I am willing to take back what I said. But I did all that, Kusum, knowing full well that Sajid Premadasa is the person that can lead us out of this mess that we are in. Right? But they denied him nominations. They refused to let him contest under the elephant. They almost forced us to go and be part of Ravi Karunanayaka's party. And because of the fact that we didn't trust that political machinery is why we went and formed the telephone. Right? That is how it happened. It was done because we had no choice. And if you remember what Mr. Wickremesinghe did to Mr. Premadasa 2 days before postal voting, he made a public announcement on Derana. Yes. It doesn't matter who is the president, I will still be the prime minister. And mind you, that was still with the 19th Amendment.
Yes.
That was still with the 19th Amendment.
Yes.
So our voter bank was worried. Our voter bank thought, what is the point of voting for Sajid if this man is still going to be at the helm? And because of the fact that he was there from 1994 and didn't show any signs of giving up, that's what the people saw. So it was sabotage from day one. But then the belief that I had in Mr. Premadasa has not even diminished by a little bit. I am still willing to lose multiple elections because of him, because I know that he is the only one who can get us out of this rut. And if you look at the internal democracy within the SJB, I have told Mr. Premadasa sometimes, I have told him, you're way too democratic sometimes. I didn't say that in the hope that he'll be an autocrat or a dictator. But the democracy that he gives within the party is unheard of to the working committee. And that is why you get certain members making statements all over the place. It's because he has given them that freedom to do so. But there is also something that these MPs of us have forgotten. A majority of them have forgotten that they won that election because of Sajid Premadasa. Yes. They actually went into parliament because of Sajid Premadasa. And how do I know this? I know this because everyone who contested under Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe lost.
Yes.
Navin Disanayaka, Akila Viraj Karyawasa, Palita Rangabandara, Palita Tevaraperuma, everyone who stuck by him, they lost their election to a level where it's as if they didn't even contest. Their votes are not even counted. Yeah. So these MPs have to understand that the only reason they are in power is because of this man. Which is why I think that as a party, we should be doing so much more to boost up Sajid Premadasa, because one man, Kusum, can't do it all. And there are certain ways that I act. Now, if you look at the way I went and protested with Hirunika outside the president's house, now I don't expect Mr. Premadasa to do that. And people shouldn't expect him to do that either. But then there are people around him who should be doing that for him. I am one of them. Hirunika is another. I would say Harsha De Silva is one. General Sarath Fonseca, Rehan Jayawickreme, Marika. There are a group of people like that. But the entire party of 52, or the group of MPs, have to now realize that the only way that this team can win is if this man wins, the leader of the team wins. So sadly, Kusum, I don't see that undying loyalty that they had towards Mr. Wickremesinghe and being an abject failure. I don't see how it's been applied on Mr. Premadasa.
That's very interesting you say this, because the SJB decimated the UNP at the last election. It was not even close. I mean, Mr. Wickremesinghe's votes were, some say were not counted, but some say under 20,000. Since that election, or especially over the last 3 to 4 months, let's say 3 months, the SJB has lost 2 or 3 very prominent members of parliament. They've crossed over, become independent. Generally speaking, there's a criticism of the opposition, especially amongst the urban populace, whereas let's say the people on social media, the liberals, who believe that there's been multiple missteps by Sajid Premadasa. So one is that they criticize him for not accepting the Prime Minister's post when it was offered to him by Gotabaya. 2 is that they object to the fact that he let Dulles run and he didn't run in the parliamentary presidential election. So there seems to be a sort of narrative that's being built up, especially within Colombo and in the Colombo-centric media especially, where they're sort of saying that, the opposition is also a problem. The opposition is also not part of the solution. So could you give us some idea of the dynamics? I mean, Mr. Premadasa has been very clear that he doesn't feel comfortable working with the current group in Parliament and on the cabinet. And he's been very clear that he wants to support the government. Even just yesterday, he was talking about a committee system, which I think has a lot of potential. So could you just give us a rough idea of where the political dynamics are right now?
There is a very famous saying, if you lay with dogs, you wake up with ticks. Right? It has been commonly used whenever people go and associate people that they're not supposed to associate and land themselves in trouble. They say you lay with dogs and you wake up with ticks. Now, how do you expect? Are we going to choose morals, ethics and principles over deals? Are we going to do that? And as a society, if we are okay with doing that, then I guess there is a serious deterioration in society. These are failed and hated members that Mr. Wickremesinghe has gone and had this unholy alliance with. Now everyone, Kusum, blames Gotabaya Rajapaksa for this, right? Was it Gotabaya Rajapaksa really by himself? What about the ministers who are holding portfolios now? I'm not going to go into names, but almost all the people holding portfolios with the government now are people who were very much part and parcel of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime. Have you ever heard them apologize? Have you ever heard them go in front of the public and say, look, I know, we kind of messed up and that's the reason we're in this mess? None of them have taken any responsibility. When the Muslim forced cremations were taking place, have any minister in this cabinet who was there in the Pohot tour come out and said, this is wrong? They were justifying it. They were saying this is science and we need to stick by science. When the second largest population in the world in terms of religion was being persecuted in this country, who was standing up for it? I'll tell you who was standing up for it. I was doing it in Weligama, but I was given leadership by Mr. Premadasa. Mr. Premadasa was one of the only leaders who was openly speaking about forced cremations, right? And this disastrous agricultural policy, has any of them come and apologize to the public? None of them have apologized. And how was this whole union created? This union was created because Mr. Wickremesinghe was not patient enough to give the SJB a few more days. Because the president was isolated. Mahinda Rajapaksa, former President Rajapaksa was in a Trincomalee Naval Air Base. Namal Rajapaksa was also not in the picture. One of his sons had left the country by that time. And his political machinery, the Pohot 2 had crumbled down to zero. And just like what you see in an ICU bed when you come and give a person oxygen, imagine the bed was Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the oxygen machine was Ranil Wickremesinghe. Right? He accepted this without any conditions. Right? Which is why Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa thought that it's apt to give it to him. But what if he waited for another 3 days? The protest would have amplified. The Gall-faced green, the Aragalaya, which now everyone in Colombo are criticizing after getting their job done. They used Aragalaya to send one man home, and now they have, started condemning the Aragalaya and now is in love with a bigger oppressor than the one that they sent home. Now when you think about it, I think it should have been Gota stay home. It shouldn't have been Gota go home, because there is a stark difference in the level of what we expected from Gotabaya and what we expect from Ranil Wickremesinghe. But that being said, Kusum, if we waited a few more days, they would have caved in. Now people would have said, yeah, could have, would have, and whatever. But yeah, that's what would have happened. But instead, he went and accepted the premiership. Now, what did that do? That gave some sort of legitimacy to the Pohottuwa type, and he made sure, Mr. Wickremesinghe, that he would let the Aragalaya continue up until such time that the president left. But the minute that the president left, he squashed the Aragalaya at 2 in the morning with the military, right? So when he tells people that you have a right to protest, you can't tell those people and give them an option on what they should protest about. If they want to protest about Gota go home, they have the right to do that. But they also have the right to protest about Ranil go home. So Mr. Wickremesinghe can't choose when the protest starts and when it ends. If it starts with the people, it ends with the people. It doesn't start with the people and end with the ruler. But what did he do? He used Aragalaya. He used Aragalaya to send President Gotabaya Rajapaksa home, squash the Aragalaya in one day, prove that he is a bigger dictator. I think, to be very honest with you, Kusum, even I didn't see that coming. I would have never in a million years thought that Mr. Wickremesinghe will order the attack that he ordered on the Aragalaya on that day. These were protesters who were going to leave at 2 p.m. the next day. And then he created this narrative where he said that the majority of the Aragalaya are fascist. And he used his house being burnt. He used that to his advantage. He said, my house was burnt, but I'm still standing by the constitution. And he has now twisted the narrative. And the mainstream media also has played a big role in it. And now the very Aragalaya people who actually helped us out of this mess are now being arrested on a daily basis. And who is standing by them? And Kusum, if you remember, Mr. Wickremesinghe called them terrorists. What are terrorists? Terrorist or terrorism is when armed combatants, let them be part of the civilian movement or whatever, armed combatants trying to overthrow the state or try to achieve their means through armed combat. So can you call the Aragalaya types for going and sitting on a president's chair terrorist? No. That's what you call a revolt. But it is not, they are not terrorists. But look at that narrative that they have spun now. Right? So these are few of the reasons why Mr. Premadasa finds it difficult to work with them. And how can we work? Now they say for the sake of the country, right? For the sake of the country at what cost? Is it to sacrifice our morals? Is it to sacrifice our ethics? Is it to sacrifice our principles? So at what cost are we going to do this? And what is the end objective going to be? What is the end objective out of this? The fact is that we have to work with the Pohottuwa and we are not willing to do that. So I, for one, and I'm saying this on a popular media show, that I am against the national government. I am against the national government in accepting ministries. I do not think we should accept ministries. Because once we get into that boat, Mr. Premadasa may even lose his opposition leader post.
Yes.
That could be another game plan that Mr. Wickremesinghe is trying to push us into. So what I'm saying is, let us help through committees. Has there ever been a time in Sri Lanka where people have even proposed to help through committees? No. But Mr. Premadasa has now said that precedent. But what do people in Colombo say? Some of them. They say, oh, what can committees do? But if you look at the powers of the Committee of Public Finance, COPF, and the core committee, you would know, Kusum, that with the right people in it, and not with government stooges, these have far-reaching powers.
Yes.
These have sort of judicial powers where you can recommend what your findings to a judicial body, or you can summon these members to parliament and you can get an explanation from them, and they are bound by law to answer.
Right.
And if they are not willing to make us help through committees, so be it.
In terms of an election, Rehan, people say it'll be March 2023 at the earliest. But let's say there was an election this year, or assume fairly soon. Right now, as things stand, there was some polling data that was released. Now, I don't necessarily want to go into the weeds of the of how you poll people and what the samples are and what the questions are, etc. But there is a narrative and there is some evidence to back it up that there is a strong JVP resurgence, that they're likely to. Some polls have shown that they're likely to capture as much as 30% of the vote at a general election, which has not happened in a very, very long time. But maybe you'll say the past is not a good indicator, so that's fine. How do you see this balance? Because a lot of people are trying to sort of show that the SJB with 50-something seats is actually fighting to be the main opposition against the JVP with 2 or 3 seats and the UNP with 1 seat. Whereas the conversation really should be about the SJB taking over government and building on its ranks. But the popular narrative is, oh, we should be worrying about the JVP. So could you tell us what you think about the JVP and whether you think the JVP would be a threat to SJB in any of the electorates?
I think I don't want to lie by saying that the JVP has not had a popularity boost. The JVP, in my opinion, has come a long way from the past 2 years. But that is not because of the stellar performance of the JVP. It is because of the failure of the government and what the people see as the opposition. Even though I don't think we are a failed opposition, some people expect Sajith Premadasa to behave the same way President Rajapaksa and them acted in the Pohotto, which is to spew racism, to spew hatred. So basically power at any cost. So like I said, the SJB doesn't believe in that. But I see that after the Aragalaya, I see the turning point to me was when Mr. Premadasa was attacked, when he went to Golface and when AKD was not attacked. I think that is where the swing happened. That is when people started, because I started seeing that a lot in Weligama. I started listening to people say, you know, how come Sajith came and Sajith was attacked and why wasn't Anur Kumar Dissanayake attacked? And the narrative that the JVP spun was that Sajith Premadasa came with security. Now I'm asking you, I'm going to counter twist that and I'm going to ask Mr. AKD, what would have happened that day if Sajith Premadasa came without security? They would have killed him. He was attacked with poles, he was attacked with sticks, and the only reason that he couldn't get past was because there were STF officers guarding him. So what does Mr. AKD have to say if Sajith Premadasa came without security? They would have killed him, Kusum. They would have killed it and they killed him and they would have blamed it on the people. So I think that was a twist that I saw. Right? That is where it started going downhill for them. And then for me came the instance where when the Aragalaya was intensifying and when there were more and more people coming in to Golface, they came forward and they said, we are the ones who started this. When it was indeed not only them, there was the FSP, there was the IUSF, there were multiple groups, there were about 120 odd groups. They were only one group there. But they came and openly started taking responsibility, thinking that they can politically come out on this. And then that is the second thing. The third thing, the last thing I think what they messed up was, you know, at the end of the day, I think Parliament, even though a lot of people say it should have been burned, I think doing that would have put our country further into disarray. But when people I respect, like Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, for example, even to this day I respect her very much. I think I don't think she belongs in the JVP. I think her ideologies are more suited towards a party like the SJB or a more progressive party. But when they were standing outside Parliament and encouraging people to come and attack Parliament, I think that too went against them. I don't think Dr. Amarasuriya did that, but people like Bimala Ratnayaka, they were there and people didn't see anything good coming out of that. So I think I do agree with you that the JVP in social perception had a very high standing, but I think the more and more elections are delayed, the further downhill the JVP is going to travel. And also, lastly, one other thing was, I think they messed up is by launching their policy document. And I think you and I have both read that. I'm sure you have too. There was nothing substantial in it. It was just about the economy. Okay, we'll come and do this. But there was no saying, how do we get from A to B to C to D? It was just, let's do A. But how do you do A? Yeah. So I think that was also ill-timed. And I think that also gave a rough understanding.
Just to remain with the subject of elections, how do you think an election would go in Colombo? Do you think the UNP might have a resurgence now that there's a Ranil Wickremesinghe president who might even deliver material gains to the Sri Lankan people after a recession? Do you think the SJB's electorate that they took from the UNP at the last general election is at risk at all, do you think?
Look, there's always a risk calculation in politics, but then you could also understand that when Mr. Wickremesinghe became president, UMP supporters were lighting firecrackers all over the country. But there was not even one instance in one major town where there were more than 50 people. And that to me was very shocking, because our people love power, and I thought that Mr. Wickremesinghe will be able to bring a bigger force. But he's already, I think, mentioned the fact that he wants to strengthen the UMP. And but one thing I don't think that under his leadership, I don't know about the UMP in general and who they'll appoint after him, but if Mr. Wickremesinghe does not let this go, and this is a perfect time for him to do it, he can now say, look, I'm going to run the country, and I'm going to appoint Ruwan or Naveen or someone else as the leader. So he's not doing that, which means that he's still very much.
That's, I mean, you make a very good point, actually, because I think both of us at different times in our lives have been UNPs. We've been UNP supporters, like real hardcore UNP supporters. And to finally see, after all this time, a UNP president, Ranil Wickremesinghe himself, becoming the president of the country, instead of being overjoyed and having this moment as these people that used to really are Kapua Kola people, we don't have that. Instead, it's, we find that he's aligned himself with the most ultra-nationalist party that we've had in recent memory, and that's quite a strange dynamic. And I also want to just ask you about the in the early 1990s, there was a contention when Ranasinghe Premadasa was essentially out. He was the first national level leader that the country had. That's from outside the political elite, the established elite. Some even mention the caste, even though we should not even be talking about that in the 21st century in 2022. But these were things that were discussed in the 90s, that were openly alluded to. And there were even impeachment proceedings brought by Gamini Dissanayake and Lalitha Athuratmudali against President Ranasinghe Premadasa. So do you see a similar dynamic happening in the UNP, or that's happened in the UNP, whereby the established order of Ranil Wickremesinghe, etc., were just simply not willing to allow a new establishment through Mrs. Untitled Premadasa to enter the UNP?
I think that's a very good and pertinent question you asked. When you look at history, this happened in the late 80s. This is when this problem started happening. In the late 80s, I think 1988, when President Ranasinghe Premadasa was given nominations to contest presidency, he didn't get it on a platter. Even though he was the Prime Minister, even though he was the only deputy leader at that time of the UMP, Mr. Jayawardena had a lot of pressure from Lalitha Athuratmudali and Gamini Dissanayake not to give this to President Premadasa. And that's when you see the difference between J.R. Jayawardena and Ranil Wickremesinghe. I mean, yes, I blame J.R. Jayawardena for a lot of things that have gone wrong in this country. But I also want to retaliate how he acted in that circumstance. What he did was, he consulted his General Secretary, Ranjan Wijeratne, who was one of his most trusted lieutenants, and who was not even very close to President Premadasa at the time, but he was more or less a JR appointee, bought right from the national list, chairman of the party, General Secretary of the party, Defense Minister. And he asked Mr. Wijeratne, General Wijeratne, to do a survey, all island, to find out what the pulse of the people is. And he wanted the report done in about a week or two. So Mr. Wijeratne, he gave a detailed report. Now at that time, the splinter group that didn't want Mr. Premadasa thought that Ranjan, being part of the establishment, will give a report beneficial to Gamini Dissanayake and Lalitha Athuratmudali. That report, very interestingly, the content of it was that the pulse of the people is with President Premadasa, Prime Minister Premadasa, that he is being perceived as someone from the working class who can rejuvenate the UMP and can bring the UMP on track. And guess what President Premadasa did? President Premadasa based his decision on that public report. And nominations to President Premadasa at that time were signed by the General Secretary Ranjan Wijeratne, who was pro-establishment back in the day, right? Who was from a fluent family, who had connections with the Sena Nayakas, who was a planter. You know, at that time, planters were given to people from distinguished families, and that's how it. I'm not saying that's right, but that's how it was then, and that's how it happened. But since the time that happened, the splinter group in the UMP did not want to accept President Premadasa, which is why they opted for that no confidence motion, the impeachment, which is why they formed the DNF and suffered a humiliating defeat. And for me, history repeats. Because isn't that the same thing what happened to Sajith Premadasa?
Right.
Sajith Premadasa was deputy leader to J.R. Jayawardena's nephew Ranil Wickremesinghe. Sajith Premadasa could have been the presidential candidate. However, unlike J.R. Jayawardena, President Ranil Wickremesinghe completely opted to sideline Sajith Premadasa, expelled a few of his members and didn't give him the presidency. But President J.R. Jayawardena did not do that. He went by the pulse of the people. So, and like the DUNF suffered a humiliating defeat, the UMP suffered a humiliating defeat at the last elections, at the last general elections. And that's why I say history always repeats.
Yeah.
But at that time, I think J.R. Jayawardena did the best move that he could have made by appointing President Premadasa. And Kusum, one more thing, do you know the 1983 riots? One of the main contention points, what really annoyed the Sinhalese, was that President J.R. Jayawardena did a mass burial of the soldiers that were killed in Colombo.
Yes.
But do you know someone who advised against it? Someone who told President Jayawardena not to bring them to Colombo, that it will cause tension, was none other than Ranasinghe Premadasa. It was Ranasinghe Premadasa at that time who told President Premadasa that bringing these bodies to Colombo is going to cause what popularly was known later as the Black July riots. But President Premadasa did agree, President J.R. Jayawardena agreed that he is not going to do it. But there was a minister at the time, I think Tissa, can't really remember his name, something to do with, not Tissa Vitana, but some Tissa, a very famous UMP politician. He said to President J.R. Jayawardena that this is a three-pronged attack. One is coming from the south with the JVP uprising, one is going to be from the north, and one is going to be from your own party. So then President J.R. Jayawardena made the untimely decision of burying those bodies in Colombo and making a huge spectacle out of it. So people who call President Premadasa a racist fails to understand that he was one of the first people who told President Jayawardena not to do it, not to bring those bodies to Colombo.
As we've just discussed about the establishment in the UNP, and we see the Wickremesinghe and the Premadasa drama of the late 80s, early 90s. What we witnessed in the SLFP and the Rajapaksas versus the Bandaranayakas in the 2005 period, it's a very similar sort of dynamic that happened.
Absolutely.
Correct?
Yeah.
And currently what we see though is that the establishment seems to have stuck it out in the SLFP. And they seem to have stuck it out in the UNP as well.
Yeah.
Because both the establishments had to make their, I mean, it's difficult to even call Ranasinghe Premadasa's tenure an establishment because he was only there at the very top for 6-7 years, whereas a lot of the other familial connections are, generations even prior to independence, some of the connections. But all things considered, is it time to perhaps move away from these established parties? And can we then answer the question of, is the SJB also going to be the party of the Premadasas? Because that's also something that's discussed in Colombo. So how would you answer that?
Sajith Premadasa has a wife, as far as I know, Jalini Premadasa. He does not have children, and he has not appointed any of his family members to any position within the SJB.
Right.
He has not done it.
Absolutely none.
Of course, Jalini Premadasa is part of the Samagi Wanita Balawege, which is a women's group,
right,
of our party.
But there are no family members.
There are absolutely no family members, and that considering the fact that his sister Dulanjali has two very smart kids, and one of them is also very politically minded and has done a lot of research for different government bodies. But do you even know his name? Do I know his name? We don't. Do we know who Sajith's friends are? A minister who went recently keeps on speaking about a person. But other than that, Sajith Premadasa, I'll tell you one thing, Kusum, from what I know about this man, is that he will not favor anyone that he doesn't think is suitable enough to be granted a favor. Because he believes very strongly in meritocracy.
Right.
The Singapore model. But very recently, he told us that we need to formulate a sort of new justice system in Sri Lanka, a mix between the Australian system and the Singapore system. Because the Singapore system also has a very dynamic legal body, and the Australian system has a more liberal version, but is also very effective. So he wants all these things done. And this is not a traditional political party. I challenge anyone who knows about party constitutions to try and get your hand onto a UMP constitution. Do you know, Kusum, that the UMP constitution has been diluted so many times that not even a member of the UMP has a proper copy. The only copies of the constitution that are given is what Mr. Wickremesinghe thinks that should be seen by its members. But it's a very open secret. You ask any UMP MP whether they have actually seen the UMP constitution. Ask a Pohottua member whether they have seen the Pohottua constitution. But come to our office and get a hold of the SJB constitution. Our SJB constitution states that the leader can be changed every year. Every year the leader of the SJB can be changed by 3 different bodies: the parliament group, the working committee, and the executive committee. No, I am not in the working committee. No, I am not in the parliamentary committee, but I am in the other 2 committees, right? And he has given that choice. And all these decisions, Kusum, about joining the government, why is everyone blaming Mr. Sajith Premadasa? Does anyone know what happened back doors? Let me tell you what happened back doors. Mr. Sajith Premadasa asked every single MP in the room, what do I do? You all tell me what should I do? But one thing he said was, when the 2 ministers, I don't want to mention their names, not very relevant to me, when they got up and when they wanted him to take it, he said, do not throw me into the lion's den without giving me some sort of insurance policy. Go and meet the president and tell him to give me a stipulated time frame in which he is going to leave. And if he is not going to leave, don't do that to me. But if you all still want me to do it, please raise your hand. There are only 2 that didn't raise their hand. Every single other MP told him not to join this government. And to the presidency, he was hell-bent on doing it. He said, even if I lose, it doesn't matter. But I want to contest for this. But a majority of the party told him to go with Dulles.
Right.
So how can he be a dictator? How can he be autocratic when all what he did was he followed the pulse of the party in which he represents? So if Sri Lankans or the Colombo elites think that this is not leadership, so be it. Then stick to this family level of politics. Stick to the crooks. Vote in people who have been accused of murder, rape and drug charges. Appoint any of them.
I think also it's interesting, Rehan, to note that we see Dr. Harsha De Silva, Mr. Rehan Jayawickreme, Mr. Kabir Hashim, members of what Mr. Premadasa calls his economic troika. And it's not that people see that the fact that they're not always on the same page as a negative. But a lot of people also understand that there's a lot of deliberation that takes place within the SJB's economic committee.
Yeah.
And what I think is perhaps important for the people to understand is that these decisions that especially given now that the country is going through this economic collapse, I don't see very many better heads in politics within the parliamentary chamber than the economic committee of the SJB. So I think that SJB team, especially with relation to our country's economy and our future stability, I think is a very key aspect.
Sri Lankans always believe in Superman. No?
Yes.
They see this one figure and they think this one figure will turn this country around.
Yeah.
Right? But the SJB is a group of Avengers.
Right.
Right? If you're thinking about comic book terms, right? Sajith Premadasa is not Superman in it. Sajith Premadasa could be Captain America with a shield, but around him you get the others, and that is Harsha De Silva. That is Rehan Jayawickreme, Kabir Hashim. All of them are part of that group. So, for the love of God, one thing I request Sri Lankans is to stop believing in this savior, and get rid of the Stockholm syndrome, where as soon as you're captive, you fall in love with you fall in love with the people that kidnapped you, right? That is why Sri Lankans are so happy with this QR code. Why should we applaud the bare minimum? Why should we applaud the screw-ups of this government?
Right.
Why should we do that? We should not applaud the bare minimum. We should hold these people accountable. And the only way, Kusum, out of this mess, like I told you, if you can name me one team better than the SJB, I will not comment. But right now, given the circumstance, SJB has the best team for the job, the best set of Avengers.
Right.
So to Sri Lankans, stop believing in all these saviors and appoint a good team. Appoint a good team that will get this country out of this mess.
And Rehan, before we wrap up, the one thing that you did want to clarify, there was an incident from a few years ago where you launched a tirade at Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, and some alleged that you had made several homophobic comments. So I think you wanted the opportunity to once again clarify what happened just for our audience. So over to you.
Do you remember I told you, Kusum, during this interview that I believe in reinventing myself? I'm going to not explain the full length of that because that will take up most of this interview. But I was trying, and they have now taken this 43-second clip of this 13-minute clip that I did, where they say that I'm launching these attacks. What I'm trying to emphasize there is that someone in power dishing out political appointments should not be done according to their sexual preference, right? Where I was talking about the, you know whose I'm talking about, the people that is appointed. That's what I was trying to emphasize. But if Mr. Wickremesinghe was straight, and if he dished out this appointment, and if he was married, and he dished out these appointments to his mistresses, I would also be vocal about it. But I do know that it is not something that it is not a subject that I should have spoken about, because of the fact that it has such a big social stigma in this country, and because of the fact that I have friends, certain family members who are gay. I thought it was letting them down, and I made a public apology. And Aritha Wickremesinghe, one of the foremost activists in Sri Lanka at the moment, he went at me for saying what I said, and I issued a public apology, and they accepted it. People like Aritha, who are very much part of the LGBTQ community, I don't want to mention names on this interview, but they were all accepting of my apology because they know I'm not a homophobe. I believe I am not a homophobe, right? And I apologize to them. But now what's funny is that I am not being attacked on social media by the LGBTQ community. I am being attacked by those that are straight, who are saying that I hate the gay community. So I want to get that out. I wanted to clear my chest and say I was only talking about dishing out political appointments based on your sexual preference. But what I should have said was, it could have been, you can be straight, you can be bi, you can be trans, you can be gay. But I did not mention that because I was also very angry that I had just lost my position as the mayor. I was going to do a lot of work for Weligama. All that was cut short. I would have still been mayor if Mr. Wickremesinghe didn't remove me. So all that was working in my head. But then again, Kusum, I offered a public apology, and I sincerely felt bad about it. But other than that, what more can I do? I don't have a Back to the Future type car, time machine car where I can go back in time and change these, right? All I can do is be better.
So with that, Rehan, thank you very much for doing this. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Kusum.
Let's do this again sometime soon. Good luck.
For sure. Thank you, Kusum.